And this is Book TV on C-SPAN 2. Currently, we are in London conducting interviews with British authors, and we're joined now by British historian Antony Beevor. And he has written several books on World War II and related topics. And if we could start with a semi-related topic, Professor Beevor, the Spanish Civil War, how did that begin, and did it have a role in the beginning of World War II?
It was definitely part of what is described as the long war of the 20th century, which may say started in 1917 and not ended till 1989. I mean, it's a wonderful debating point for historians, but one doesn't want to go too far down that road. It was definitely, if you like, a form of sort of international civil war by proxy, and many people in Spain regard it as the opening round of the Second World War. But it was very much more of a sort of test bed for weapons, particularly for the Nazis, when they were working out their tactics and particularly their weapons for the Luftwaffe, and also the Soviets using their equipment and weapons there. They learned quite a bit as well.
How did that war begin, the Spanish Civil War?
The war began, really, it was a cycle of fear and violence, and the Spanish Republic, which was started, which came to power really in 1931, when Alfonso XIII, the King of Spain, was forced to abdicate. And in the elections, at the very beginning of 1936, the Popular Front, which was a leftist coalition, won, and there was such mutual dislike and fear between them and the right. And in July 1936, there was the rising of the generals led by General Francisco Franco, and this civil war, which started that particular summer of 1936, didn't end until the beginning of 1939.
Who won?
Very much the right, the nationalists under General Franco, and helped, of course, by Hitler and by Mussolini, who sent so-called volunteer troops. In fact, there were many more Italian troops, but the vital contribution of the Nazis was the Condor Legion from the Luftwaffe. So
was Spain part of World War II as well, the Franco regime?
I would not say that it was part of World War II, despite, I think, the left in Spain certainly seemed to regard it as part of World War II. But Franco's role really was to try to stay neutral. He did not want to be involved because Spain was so weakened.
Antony Beevor, one of your recent books is The Fall of Berlin, 1945. That was the U.S. title. What was life like in Berlin January through April, May of 1945?
To begin with, fear, the prospect of the attack of the Red Army, and knowing very well that the Soviet Union, and particularly the soldiers of the Red Army, had much to avenge after all the atrocities committed by the Wehrmacht and the SS in the Soviet Union. So everybody was afraid, and not knowing when they were going to come and all the rest of it. And suddenly, in middle of January, this vast attack started, really from the River Vistula in Poland all the way through to within 60 miles of Berlin. For the people there, and particularly for the women, it was frightening. They'd heard rumours of the mass rapes in East Prussia, and they were, not surprisingly, absolutely terrified. And in fact, if you like, the behaviour of the Red Army was simply appalling. It wasn't just in Germany. I mean, there were also in Hungary and even in Poland and Yugoslavia. The Red Army was actually completely out of control. One thinks of Stalinist society being absolutely regimented, but in fact there was very little control over the soldiers, and when they got drunk they simply couldn't be stopped.
For most of World War II, was Berlin a safe haven for Germans?
It wasn't a safe haven from the point of view of air raids. I mean, Berlin was one of the chief targets, particularly of Bomber Command, a Royal Air Force Bomber Command led by Chief Marshal Harris in his rather controversial strategic bombing offensive. And the Americans too, the American Air Force also bombed Berlin. So a lot of the city had been smashed, but because it was so spread out, you didn't get the conflagrations, and therefore the city survived more intact than one would have imagined. But then when the Russians arrived, of course, and you had 6 Soviet armies attacking towards the centre, all of them with heavy artillery and with supporting air forces, by the end of it, of course, Berlin was pretty well smashed to pieces.
1942. What was life like then? Was there cinema? Was there electricity? Were there shortages? What was the city life like?
The city life in Berlin was, on the whole, carried on fairly normally, particularly for those, say, who had money or, above all, had contacts and influence in the Nazi Party. Those who were, say, friends of the leaders certainly had a very good life. But for the most of the population, things had started to get very tough. There weren't shortages because the Nazi regime made sure that, in fact, it was the occupied countries who suffered. In fact, hunger was basically exported and the food was taken back from the occupied countries. So there wasn't real hunger in that particular way, but there was certainly shortages of petrol above all, and of heating and other things. But real hunger didn't actually start until really 1945, until actually the invasion.
Were the bombing raids that the Allies conducted on Berlin strategically important?
They did not achieve their objective, that is certain. What they did achieve, though, and this is the important aspect, I think, is that they forced the Luftwaffe, because Hitler was so furious about these bombing raids the whole time, they forced Goering to withdraw the bulk of his fighter squadrons and anti-aircraft guns from the Eastern Front. And this actually made a huge difference. Russian historians won't really acknowledge this, but even Stalin was aware of it very much at the time, that the bombing campaign, in fact, helped the Red Army enormously in 1943 and 1944 especially.
Antony Beevor, the role of the Soviet Union, we in the West, do we know enough about the role of the Soviet Union when it comes to World War II?
On the whole, in the West, we tended to see it as from a Eurocentric point of view, and obviously from the United States, and certainly when one thinks of some of the films like Saving Private Ryan, one would have thought that sort of nobody else was involved in the war. But one has to recognize the fact that 90% of Wehrmacht casualties took place on the Eastern Front. And, of course, the Soviet Union had appalling losses. I mean, they lost 9 million men in their armed forces and at least another 16 million civilians. I mean, it was a terrifying loss. So from that point of view, the Allies really had a certain blood guilt towards the Soviet Union, which was one of the reasons why Stalin was able to manipulate both Roosevelt and Churchill.
What were Hitler's tactical reasons for invading the Soviet Union in 1942?
Well, Hitler always used to quite often come up with certain reasons for some people, and then his other reasons, which were more, should we say, secret or personal, he didn't speak about so much. What one finds very much in the case of the invasion of the Soviet Union, the basic idea was to pillage the Soviet Union of its oil, of its natural resources, and basically to turn the population into a sort of slave state. It was going to be a German colony. It was going to be the breadbasket for Nazi Germany. And this was an idea, actually, which was really started in 1918, when at the end of the First World War, the Germans invaded and occupied the bulk of Ukraine and a lot of southern Russia, and to use it as their breadbasket. So Hitler was very much working on that in his main objectives.
The Battle of Stalingrad, another one of your books.
Yes.
Talk about that, please.
Stalingrad was probably, in fact, I think one can say certainly, was the military and the psychological turning point of the Second World War. One could certainly argue that the American entry into the war in December 1941 and the Russian defense, if you like, of Moscow in December 1941 was probably the geopolitical turning point. But Stalingrad was an astonishing battle. It was one of the worst urban savageries that one's ever seen, the way that you had these armies fighting in the ruins of normal life of houses, and they were fighting in the cellars and in the sewers and everything. And, of course, in a way, this actually threw the Germans. They were used to using their superiority of aircraft and tanks and mobile warfare. And this was very significant because, in fact, they had actually reached their cumulative point, I think, at this stage, i.e. they had lost the initiative. And this was where, of course, they were then surrounded in a surprise attack by the Soviet Union when they thought that the Soviet Union was at its last gasp. And that was the real turning point, because from that point, the Germans knew that the war was going to end in Berlin, and the Soviet soldiers knew that now they were going to win after all.
Antony Beevor, if you would, compare Joseph Stalin as a war leader to Winston Churchill as a war leader?
Stalin was a disastrous war leader to begin with in 1941. I mean, he refused to